The wind howled like a warning, its icy fingers cutting into Elias Ward's weathered skin as he trudged through the unforgiving Montana blizzard. His hound, Grit, led the way, muscles tense and ears perked, sniffing the cold air. The snow stung Elias's face, a bitter reminder of how harsh the frontier could be. The storm was relentless, the darkness swallowing the landscape as Elias moved forward, one foot in front of the other. His mind, heavy with the ghost of his past, barely registered the biting cold or the suffocating wind. He was used to solitude. Then Grit stopped. The hound froze, nostrils flaring, and Elias's heart skipped a beat. Something was ahead. He squinted, through the flurry, barely able to make out the silhouette beneath a pine. It was a shape, slumped and unmoving. Grit growled low, but Elias stayed still, waiting. It could have been anything. A bear, a shadow, or worse. But the instinct, honed over years of surviving alone, told him this was different. He closed the distance, his boots sinking into deep snow. A sense of urgency surged as he knelt beside the figure. A woman. Her tattered wedding dress clung to her frozen body, a veil tangled in branches, the fabric stained by the elements. Her skin was pale, her lips blue. She was half frozen, a living ghost. Elias's calloused hand hovered near her neck. He checked her pulse. Faint, barely there, a whisper of life. Grit whimpered at his side, his eyes full of a knowing, unspoken fear. The woman's hand twitched, and Elias's breath caught in his throat. She was still alive. His gaze fell on the letter clutched tightly in her hand, singed at the edges, its ink blurred by the storm's moisture. He reached for it, careful not to wake her, if she was even capable of waking. His fingers traced the delicate, charred paper, and his eyes scanned the barely legible name, Amos Tate. The name hit Elias like a punch to the gut. His cousin, the one man from his past he never wanted to see again. Elias looked back at the woman, his thoughts racing. Who was she? And why was she dying in the snow? What had brought her to this forsaken place? His heart hammered in his chest as he carefully lifted her. Grit's low growl echoing in the distance. Elias's footsteps were the only sound against the blizzard's deafening roar. She wasn't just any stranger. Whoever she was, her secrets were about to unravel everything he thought he knew. The snowstorm raged on, its icy gusts biting through the night, pushing Elias Ward further into the wilderness. His face, rough and scarred from years of living in the unforgiving Montana frontier, was numb from the cold. Every step felt like a weight dragging him down, but he pressed forward, his boots sinking deeper into the snow with each movement. Grit, his loyal hound, trudged ahead, leading the way with a sense of purpose. The dog's keen instincts knew the terrain well, guiding them through the blizzard's howl. Grit's breath formed little clouds in the air, his eyes darting back every few steps to ensure Elias was close. Elias's thoughts were heavy, his mind haunted by memories of a past he couldn't escape. His sister's death, a tragedy tied to a mining accident years ago, still clung to him like a ghost, whispering in the silence of the storm. She had been his last link to any semblance of family, and since her death, Elias had become a shadow, living alone in the mountains, with only Grit by his side. The ache in his chest was familiar now, something he had learned to live with, but it never stopped gnawing at him. When he first saw the figure lying in the snow beneath the pine, Elias thought it was just another shadow of the storm. But as they got closer, the form took shape. A woman, her body half buried in the snow, her wedding dress torn and stained with dirt and ice. Her pale face was barely visible, her lips blue, her skin lifeless and cold. Elias's heart lurched in his chest. He'd seen death before, but not like this. Not a woman, alone and vulnerable in such a brutal world. Grit had stopped, standing over her with his head lowered, sniffing the air. His ears flattened in a way that told Elias this wasn't just another encounter with nature's cruelty. Elias knelt beside the woman, checking her pulse, which was faint, but still there. His fingers trembled as they brushed her frost-bitten skin, but he quickly pulled her close, cradling her in his arms. The weight of her felt like the weight of his past, each step he took carrying the burden of her survival. As Elias moved forward through the storm, carrying her against his chest, he kept his eyes fixed ahead, but glanced down at her fragile form occasionally. The cabin's dim glow was a beacon through the snow, a warm refuge against the cold. His thoughts wandered to the risk of what he was doing. There had been no plan to help anyone. He was a man who kept to himself, who sought peace in solitude. But something about her pulled at him, a feeling he couldn't shake. The snow was falling harder, and every step felt like it could be their last, yet he didn't hesitate. His hound Grit led the way, guiding them with the steady confidence that only a dog could have amid a storm. As they neared the cabin, Elias's thoughts shifted. His mind raced through the possibilities. Who was this woman? How had she ended up here, alone and dying in the snow? He was no stranger to hardship. But this felt different. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire greeted them. Elias carefully laid the woman on the old worn blanket that had seen countless nights of use. Her hands, frostbitten and trembling, seemed to absorb the heat of the fire as he tended to her, slowly rubbing warmth into her limbs. But even as he worked, his eyes drifted back to the letter she had clutched tightly in her hand. The edges were burned, singed by the fire or the storm, and the ink was smeared. He couldn't make out much, but there was a name that stuck out, one that he knew all too well. Amos Tate. Amos, his cousin. The one man Elias had tried to forget. It had been a decade since they'd last spoken, a decade since they'd gone, their separate ways, but the name still burned in his memory like a scar. Elias ran his fingers over the letter, reading the few words he could decipher, and a knot formed in his stomach. Amos Tate, the man he had sworn never to trust again, was somehow tied to this woman's fate. His eyes met Grit's, who stood by the door, watching with that knowing look. The hound could sense something Elias couldn't put into words. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing inside him. This woman wasn't just a stranger. She was a connection to the past, to a man who had betrayed him. But she was also in need. Someone Elias had no choice but to help. Elias's gaze shifted back to the woman as he carefully warmed her hands. He had no idea who she was, why she was here, or what her connection to Amos was, but there was one thing he knew for sure. This moment, this decision, would change everything. Elias didn't believe in fate, but it felt as if fate had come to claim him, just as it had claimed his sister. He was no hero, but he couldn't walk away. The fire crackled in the background, filling the silence between them. But Elias's mind was loud with questions. What had Amos done to this woman? Why had she been left to die? And more importantly, why had fate brought them together on this cold, snow-covered night? Have you ever risked everything for a stranger's life? The thought echoed in his mind as if the storm asked the question. Elias didn't have the answers yet, but he knew one thing. He would find them. The cabin was small, the kind that could only offer warmth through the glow of a fire and the sense of a shared space. The wind howled outside, pushing against the fragile walls. But inside, there was only the crackle of burning wood and the soft hum of Elias's movements. The heat from the fire touched everything. The cold, the silence, the unease that hung between him and the woman lying on his blanket. Elias glanced down at Lila. She stirred, a soft murmur slipping from her lips as her fingers twitched, finding their way toward the warmth of the fire. Her skin was pale, nearly translucent in the cabin's dim light, and her breathing was shallow but steady. Tangled and matted with snow, her hair lay around her face like the remnants of a storm she couldn't escape. Elias could feel the tension in the air, how her body reacted to each small movement, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would reveal more than he was ready to understand. He stoked the fire, the flames, licking the edges of the iron kettle on the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. A cracked mug sat beside a pile of rough-hewn quilts, the edges frayed from years of use. The cabin was a testament to survival, built with a simplicity that made everything inside essential but worn. The quilt beneath Lila was faded and patched, a small comfort in a life too harsh for luxuries. The scent of burning wood filled the room, mingling with the faint trace of snow that clung to her dress, still damp from the storm. Lila's eyes fluttered open, half-conscious, her lips moving in whispers as she searched for words that didn't quite come. Elias leaned in, not wanting to startle her but listening closely. He couldn't make out much at first, just a few disjointed sounds, names. Her voice was fragile, and Elias had to lean closer to hear. Amos, she whispered, and the name settled in the room like a shadow. His fingers paused in their work, the locket now in his hands. He hadn't noticed it before, hidden in the folds of her dress, but it was unmistakable now. Amos's initials etched into the metal, worn smooth from years of wear. The name felt like a weight in his palm, a link to a past he wanted to forget. He stared at it momentarily, the weight of the realization pressing down on him. This woman was tied to his cousin, the man who had abandoned him and betrayed him. But what did that mean for her? Elias hadn't expected to feel sympathy, yet the sight of her, cold, bruised, lost, stirred something deep inside him, something he hadn't acknowledged in a long time. He couldn't deny it. She was no stranger to suffering, just as he wasn't. At this moment in this cabin, they were both broken pieces of a world that had given them little but hardship. He reached for his only blanket, which he had kept for himself through many lonely nights in the mountains. Without a word, he spread it over her, his hands moving carefully, his touch soft despite the roughness of his life. She flinched slightly, but only for a moment, as if she too were unsure of the kindness being shown to her. Her eyes were still heavy, her body stiff with the lingering cold. Lila let out a soft sigh, a fleeting sound that tugged at something in Elias's chest. She muttered again, this time the words clearer, though still indistinct. Her voice cracked, as she whispered, barely audible, I had to run. Train station. Secrets. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of what they implied. Elias's brow furrowed as he leaned closer, trying to catch the full meaning. She had run. Run from something. Someone. The word secrets echoed in his mind, repeating itself like a warning. Her fiancé's secrets. The kind of secrets that could drive a woman into the storm, into the arms of a stranger she barely knew. Elias didn't speak. He didn't ask her to elaborate. He wasn't sure he wanted to hear more, but part of him knew he needed to. His mind raced, but he remained quiet, watching as she drifted back into a half-sleep, her breaths slow and steady. The fire crackled, and the wind outside was a constant reminder of the world beyond the cabin walls. He sat back against the wall, his eyes never leaving her. The unease from earlier hadn't gone away, it only deepened. Amos. The name lingered like smoke in the air, and now Lila's cryptic words seemed to tie them both to him. The questions piled up in his mind, but Elias couldn't bring himself to ask. What kind of man would deceive a woman like this? What had Amos done to her? And why had she chosen to run into a storm, into a man she knew nothing about, rather than face whatever secrets he kept? Lila shifted beneath the quilt, a slight tremor running through her body. Elias's gaze softened, and he felt his loneliness lessen for the first time in days. The quiet in the cabin wasn't just the absence of noise. It was something more. It was a shared space, a moment of trust, even unspoken. The fire crackled again, casting flickers of light on the walls. Outside, the wind continued its assault, but inside, the warmth grew. Elias didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know what truths Lila would reveal, or whether he'd regret saving her. But for now, all he could do was keep her safe and alive. What had Amos done to this woman? What had he been hiding all this time? Could you walk away from a dream that turned into a lie? The question filled his mind, unbidden, as he stared into the fire, waiting for answers he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. Lila's eyes fluttered open once more, her gaze unfocused, the soft light of the fire flickering against her pale skin. Her breath still trembled in the cold air, but the cabin's warmth seeped into her bones, dulling the sharp edges of her discomfort. Elias watched from across the room, his face unreadable as he carefully stirred the fire, feeding the flames to keep the chill at bay. His eyes kept returning to her, studying her without judgment but with curiosity. She hadn't spoken much since he found her, and Elias wasn't sure whether she would ever share the full story of why she was there, on the brink of death, in the middle of a Montana blizzard. Her hands, still marked with the traces of frostbite, trembled as she pushed herself up slightly, wincing at the ache in her body. Every movement was slow, deliberate, and weak. Her cracked lips parted, and her voice was barely more than a whisper. I came out here for him. For Amos. Elias stayed silent, the weight of her words settling heavily between them. His fingers paused over the wood, his grip tightening around the poker as he struggled to control his emotions. The name sounded like a burden in her mouth, one she couldn't shake even if she tried. She let out a breath, her eyes falling to her hands clasped in her lap. I was promised a ranch. A home. Her voice cracked, her words thick with the weight of a lost dream. He said we'd start a new life, build something together. Elias didn't respond, didn't press her for more. His silence felt like the only thing that might offer her comfort. She didn't need questions right now. She needed space to unravel the story herself, piece by piece. Lila's shoulders shuddered as she pulled the blanket tighter around herself, the fabric heavy with the weight of all she had left. Her face twisted in sorrow, a sadness that reached deep, even beyond the loss she had already endured. I thought I'd found a way out, to start fresh. She paused as if the words themselves had become too much. Elias kept his eyes averted, focusing on the flames as they licked the sides of the iron kettle. He didn't speak Amos's name, not yet. His cousin's shadow hung in the room even if Elias wouldn't give it form. He wasn't ready to confront what he knew about Amos, the lies and the betrayal, but Lila's voice continued, soft but persistent, like a whisper in the dark. The train station, the moment I arrived, a man, A stranger told me. He said Amos. He had another life. Her words trembled and her body shook as if the very mention of it caused her pain. He said to stay away from him, that I'd be nothing but a pawn in a game I didn't understand. But I didn't listen. I didn't want to listen. I had nothing else. Nothing else but him. Elias felt the words wrap around his chest like a vice. The storm outside raged as her confession settled in the room like a living thing, pulsing with the weight of betrayal. He had known Amos to be many things, charming, deceptive, manipulative, but never had he thought of him as a man who would ruin a woman like this. A promise of a future built on lies, a life that turned into something cold and broken. Lila's gaze wandered to the fire, and Elias caught the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. I didn't know. I didn't know what I was walking into. I thought he loved me. The fire crackled, the room settling into a heavy silence. Elias leaned back against the wall, questioning the truth of her words. Amos. The man who had promised her everything, the man who had left her to die. Elias didn't know what to feel. Anger at his cousin, pity for the woman before him, or some twisted form of empathy he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge. Her eyes met his then, dark with pain and regret. I ran, she whispered. When I heard what he'd done, I couldn't stay, I thought, if I left, maybe I'd have a chance, but the storm, Elias, came so fast and I had nowhere else to go. Elias's heart clenched. She had risked everything on the promise of a future that had never been hers. Her hands shook with the memory of that fear, the terror that drove a person to flee even into the unknown, even when the world was against them. Her eyes spoke the words she couldn't say. She had lost everything. The fire danced in the hearth, its light painting the cabin in hues of orange and gold, but there was nothing warm between them now. There was only the rawness of what had been and what could never be undone. Elias felt his pulse quicken. Could you walk away from a dream that turned into a lie? The question struck him like a revelation, the very thing he had feared. He had walked away from a family, a life that was once his, but for her it was different. She had been betrayed by a man who had promised her a future that had never existed. It was a betrayal he could understand, but he wished he hadn't. Lila's face softened and a tear slipped down her cheek, though she quickly wiped it away as if the act of crying was something she no longer allowed herself. The silence between them grew thick with the weight of her confession. The fire crackled again, and outside the storm howled. But inside the cabin, something had shifted. Elias didn't know what the future held for them, or if they were both caught in the same storm of lies, but he understood one thing. Lila was no longer a stranger. She had a past, a truth that hurt more than the frostbite on her hands, a truth that had brought her to this moment. And as much as he wanted to turn away and keep his distance, Elias knew there was no walking away from the truth now. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting flickering shadows across the cabin's walls as Elias sat hunched over, the burned letter still clenched tightly in his hands. The paper, singed at the edges, was fragile, and the ink smeared in places, making it almost unreadable. But Elias, with the patience of someone who had spent years deciphering the small, imperfect details of life in the mountains, focused on the few words he could make out. Amos's name stood out, unmistakable. He could see promises of land, a future, a life, but cryptic warnings were scattered throughout the letter. Elias frowned, his brow furrowing as he studied the blurred words. Some of them were barely legible, the ink smudged, but the meaning was clear. Something had gone wrong. Something had been hidden. He let out a breath, setting the letter aside for a moment. There was too much to untangle, too many pieces of a puzzle he wasn't ready to solve. But the fragments had so far told him one thing: Amos had lied. He had always lied. And now, the lies had brought this woman, this stranger, to his doorstep. Elias leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking under his weight. He rubbed a hand across his face, exhaustion sinking in as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The storm outside raged, but here, in the dim light of the cabin, a quiet stillness surrounded him. He needed answers, but how much of this could he trust? How much of it was just another layer of deception? His gaze drifted to the table, where an old ledger sat, its cover worn and faded. It had been left untouched for years, but now it felt like the key to something much bigger than himself that tied him to Amos's past and Lila's present. He opened the ledger slowly, flipping through the brittle pages until one entry caught his eye. It was dated years ago. A land deal Amos had tried to secure but failed, the signatures scrawled in a rushed, careless manner. There were mentions of debts, disputes over land ownership, and a name that appeared far too frequently in the margins. Lila Hale. Elias paused. The name. Lila Hale. The woman in front of him was the one whom Amos had promised a future. And yet, there she was, tied to a failed deal and promise. His fingers traced the entry as his thoughts swirled. What was Amos's connection to this woman? What kind of deal had he made with her? The next page revealed something even more unsettling. A brief, almost hidden note in the corner of the ledger. A marriage certificate. But the names didn't match what Elias had expected. The entry suggested that Amos had been married before Lila, and before this. The ink was fresh, the handwriting sharp and unmistakable, and it wasn't Lila's name that appeared next to Amos's. Elias's heart sank as the full weight of the revelation hit him. Amos had been married to someone else before, and yet Lila had been led to believe she was the first, the only one. The letter, the ledger, everything was a web of lies that now tangled around them. He looked at Lila, still sitting by the fire, her face weary but calm. She had no idea what this meant. She had no idea what the man she had trusted had done. Lila stirred, drawing Elias's attention back to her. Her eyes met his, and there was a shift between them at that moment. A quiet understanding, an unspoken bond forming out of shared secrets. He hadn't told her everything yet, not even close. But she could sense the change in his demeanor. The questions that had clouded his thoughts were now giving way to answers he wasn't ready to share. Lila reached for the mug of coffee Elias had brewed earlier, her hand still shaking as she lifted it to her lips. The warmth of the drink seemed to steady her, and her eyes momentarily closed as she took in a simple comfort. Elias oversaw her, his mug resting untouched beside him. The quiet between them was different now, filled with the weight of everything left unsaid. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice quiet but firm. "I didn't know about the marriage. The lies." Elias didn't speak at first. He wasn't sure what to say. The past felt too close now, too tangled in the moment, in the cabin's quiet. But he knew one thing. This woman had been wronged, and somehow she had found her way to him. "No one ever tells the whole truth," Elias replied finally, his voice rough from the weight of his past. "Not even Amos." Lila nodded, her fingers gripping the mug tightly as if it kept her grounded. She didn't look up at him, but Elias could feel her trying to process everything. The silence between them deepened the truth of the ledger's revelations, hanging in the air, heavy and undeniable. Outside, the storm still raged, but the warmth was different inside the cabin. It wasn't just the fire. It wasn't just the drink they shared. It was something deeper, and trust was beginning to form. Elias hadn't expected it. He hadn't wanted it, not at first. But now, with the weight of what they both knew between them, it felt inevitable. The night outside was clear now, the storm weakening. Through the small window, Elias could see the starry sky, bright and sharp above the snow-covered ground. The air was still, the mountains cloaked in their winter silence, and for the first time in a long while, Elias felt the tension in his chest begin to loosen. The world outside was cold and harsh, but inside the cabin there was warmth. There was the beginning of something new. Lila finished her coffee and set the mug aside. She looked at him then as if she were seeing him for the first time. Her eyes were soft, but the resolve in them was unmistakable. They were no longer strangers. They were tied together now by a past neither could escape. Elias exhaled slowly, setting the ledger aside. He couldn't protect her from what was coming, but he could offer her something he hadn't provided anyone in years. "You'll be safe here," he said, his voice quieter than intended. Lila didn't respond, but the small nod she gave him spoke volumes. Their unspoken bond had deepened, the weight of their shared history pulling them closer. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were beginning to trust, and that was something Elias never thought he would allow again. The quiet of the cabin was shattered by the sound of hooves crunching against the snow, their rhythmic thud growing louder as the rider drew closer. Elias's hand tightened around the handle of his rifle, his gaze narrowing toward the window. Grit, his loyal hound, growled low, his hackles rising as he paced by the door. The familiar scent of leather and dust drifted in from outside, and Elias knew who was coming before he even saw him: Amos Tate. The man Elias had hoped would stay, lost in the past. The door creaked as it swung open, the cold wind sweeping into the cabin's warmth. There, standing in the doorway, was Amos. His dusty coat hung off his shoulders like an old friend, its worn edges marked by the rough life of a drifter. The same crooked smile, that ever-present charm, stretched across his face, but there was something different about him now. A tension in his posture, a nervous energy that hadn't been there before. "Well, well," Amos drawled, stepping inside and giving a half-hearted tip of his hat. "I was hoping I'd find you here." Lila stiffened as she saw him, her hand instinctively clutching the quilt around her shoulders. Her eyes narrowed, the vulnerability that had once filled them replaced by a sharp, unmistakable anger. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at him as if she couldn't quite believe her eyes. "Amos," she finally spoke, her voice trembling with emotion, though her tone was anything but weak. "You left me to die." Elias oversaw her, standing from his chair, his hand still hovering near the rifle. He had no intention of drawing it yet, but the way Amos entered the cabin made him feel like a storm was about to break. Amos chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. His eyes flickered between Elias and Lila, calculating as if he were measuring them both. "I didn't leave you, Lila, He paused, seeming to struggle for the right words, his smile fading slightly. "I had business to attend to, that's all." Lila's voice cracked, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Business? You fled, Amos. Without a word, you left me in that station, in that storm. What kind of man does that?" Amos's smile twisted, more forced now. "Now, Lila, don't make this more than it is." His voice was smooth and rehearsed, but there was an edge, a tension he couldn't completely hide. He took a step forward, his hands raised in what looked like an attempt to pacify her, but it only made the situation feel more volatile. Elias moved to stand beside Lila, his stance protective, his eyes fixed firmly on Amos. "You've got a lot of nerve coming here after what you've done." Amos's gaze flickered briefly to Elias before returning to Lila. "I never meant to hurt you, sweetheart. You've got to believe me. You hurt me the moment you lied," Lila interrupted, her voice steady but sharp as a blade. Her eyes locked with Amos's unwavering. "You promised me a life and you ran when the truth came out. You weren't looking to start a new life. You were running from your past." Amos shifted uncomfortably, his usual confidence slipping for a moment. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand plenty," she cut him off, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I understand that you lied about everything. You promised me land and a future. Instead, you left me alone, freezing in a storm. I almost died out there, Amos. I almost froze to death. And you didn't care." The words hit Amos like a slap, and he flinched visibly. His smile vanished entirely now, replaced by a tight, almost nervous expression. "It wasn't like that, Lila." He stepped back, his hands raising slightly in a placating gesture. I had no choice. A debt collector was after me. I had to run. You've got to understand. It's not what you think." Lila's eyes darkened, the fire in her gaze unwavering as she stared at him. "So you left me, abandoned me in the middle of nowhere, and that's your excuse? A debt collector?" The words felt rehearsed, as if Amos had used them many times before, trying to convince himself as much as others. The lie sounded hollow, as though he had been repeating it until he almost believed it. But Lila wasn't buying it, and neither was Elias. "You think I'm stupid?" Lila's voice dropped to a low, dangerous tone, and for a moment Elias could see the strength in her, the woman who had fought so much to survive. "You think I can't see right through you?" Amos hesitated. His usual charm was completely gone now, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes darting around the cabin, looking for an escape or a way to regain control of the situation. But there was no easy way out now. Elias stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You don't get to lie out of this, Amos. You don't get to turn your back on someone you've betrayed and think you can walk away." Amos looked from Elias to Lila, the fight slowly draining from him as if the weight of the truth was finally catching up with him. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. Instead, he just stood there, his crooked smile long gone. Lila took a deep breath, her body trembling with the emotion she had held inside for so long. She stood tall now, stronger than she had been when Elias first found her broken and freezing, in the snow. "I won't let you do this to me. Not again." Elias's hand stayed on the rifle, but his voice was a quiet promise. "You won't get away with it, Amos." The tension in the cabin thickened, and Amos, sensing the finality of the moment, seemed to shrink back slightly. But before he could say another word, Grit's growl echoed again, louder this time. A warning. "Have you ever faced someone who broke your trust?" Elias's voice cut through the silence, his gaze still fixed on Amos. Lila stood beside him, her body taut, her resolve unbreakable. Amos didn't answer. Instead, he took a step back, his eyes flicking one last time to the two of them, before he turned and walked out into the storm. The door slammed behind him, and the wind howled in the distance. Silence filled the cabin once more. But it was a different silence now, one that held the weight of a battle fought and a trust broken. Lila exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging as the adrenaline of the confrontation left her. Elias stood by her, his presence steady, unwavering. The storm outside raged on, but there was a quiet sense of victory inside. Lila had stood her ground, and together, they faced the man trying to break them both. The warmth of the fire flickered low, casting long shadows in the cabin as Elias sat by the hearth, staring into the crackling flames. Now more composed than before, Lila sat opposite him, her hands clasped together in her lap, the locket still, pressed tightly against her chest. The tension between them, though palpable, had begun to soften, replaced by an unspoken understanding that was growing stronger with every passing moment. Lila broke the silence, her voice barely more than a whisper. I knew Amos was trouble. She glanced up at him, her eyes dark with sorrow. But when you've lost everything, you do desperate things. I thought, maybe he'd give me a chance to start over and build something. But I was wrong. Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of her loss. Elias didn't respond immediately. He had heard the pain in her voice, the rawness of her confession. He didn't need to ask her to elaborate. He knew what it was like to seek solace in something that could never be real. Lila had been looking for a new beginning, just as he had been. I lost my family too, Elias said softly, his voice carrying the sorrow of years that had never quite faded. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze distant as if staring at a memory just out of reach. My sister. She died in a mining accident a few years back. A scam. We were supposed to be rich, promised everything, but it was all a lie. She didn't make it out. I barely did. Lila's eyes softened as she listened, her heart aching for the man across from her. She could see it in his eyes. The same pain in hers. The kind of grief that didn't go away, that never truly healed. The type that settled deep inside, marking every choice, every step forward with a reminder of what had been lost. I didn't have much left after that, Elias continued, his voice heavy with the burden of his past. So I left, came out here. I could outrun it. Thought I could leave everything behind, but it's not easy. The fire crackled as Elias paused, the weight of his words settling into the quiet space between them. Lila reached for the locket she hadn't yet opened, as though it were the key to the last piece of her story that had remained hidden for too long. She carefully pried it open, revealing a small folded note inside. It was worn, yellowed with age and stained at the edges. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it, eyes scanning the faded ink. The words blurred, but the name at the top of the note stood out. Elias felt his pulse quicken when he recognized Joe Amos. The letters were unmistakable. Lila's voice faltered as she read aloud. The deal is off. The land you were promised is no longer available. The man who told you lies about the mine should be punished. She paused, a sharp breath catching in her throat. He is connected to Elias Ward. He's the one who sent the miners down. He's the one who killed her. Elias's heart skipped a beat. The note was like a strike to the chest, a revelation that sent shockwaves through him. His sister's death. The scam. It had all been tied to Amos, the very man who had promised Lila a life only to abandon her, had been the one to send his sister to her death. It was all a part of the same web of lies that had haunted him for years, now entangling Lila in ways neither of them could have imagined. The room seemed to close around him as the truth settled like a stone in his stomach. He looked at Lila, his expression unreadable, and for the first time he saw her grief mirrored in his own. This wasn't just her pain. It was his too. The connection between them, fragile before, had suddenly deepened, bound by shared loss, betrayal, and the quiet understanding that neither of them had chosen the lives they were now forced to live. Lila set the note down, her fingers trembling. She looked up at Elias, her face a mixture of anger, disbelief, and sorrow. You were tied to this, to my past. I never knew. All this time, I thought it was just Amos. Elias leaned back, his hands resting on his knees, his face drawn with the weight of the revelation. He lied to both of us, he said, his voice raw. He used us both for something we couldn't see. He's been running from the truth. And now, his words trailed off, the enormity of it all pressing on him. Lila swallowed hard, the realization crashing down on her. And now what? What do we do with this? We can't change it. We can't bring back the people we lost. Elias's gaze softened, and for a moment there was nothing but the flicker of the fire, the crackling sound filling the silence between them. He could see the weight in her eyes, the same burden he carried daily. We keep moving forward, he said quietly, the words steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. We keep fighting. For what's left. What we can build, even if it's not the expected life. Lila nodded slowly, her eyes filled with pain and resolve. She had lost her family, her dreams, and her trust in the man she had once believed would give her a future. But here in this cabin, surrounded by the cold of the Montana night, she had found something else, something unexpected. A bond. A shared wound. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start over. Elias stood then, his hand moving to his rifle instinctively, but his stance was different now. No longer the man who had retreated into silence, he was a man who had shared his grief and, in doing so, had found the strength to face what was coming. He turned to Lila, his voice steady but full of purpose. What would you do if the past came back to haunt you? He asked, the question hanging between them, a reminder of the ties that bound them together, the pain that would always be a part of them. Lila's eyes met his, and she nodded once more. I'd keep moving forward. And in that moment, Elias knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The early morning sun had broken through the last remnants of the storm, casting long golden beams of light across the snow-covered land. The harsh winds had quieted, and the air felt clearer, like a fresh start had come with the new day. Inside the cabin, Elias and Lila sat by the fire, their faces marked by exhaustion but also by something else, an unspoken understanding. This partnership had slowly but surely formed over the last few days. Outside, the world had shifted. The snow was melting, the ground softening beneath the warming sun, and the trees seemed to stir with the promise of spring. Elias glanced out the window, his mind drifting to the future. They could build a future that was no longer just his own, but something together. He turned back to Lila, who sat beside him, her face calm, but her eyes focused. She had become more than just the woman he had found in the snow. She had become his ally, someone who understood the pain of betrayal and the weight of survival. The sudden sound of hooves outside broke the quiet, and Elias stood quickly, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. Lila was already on her feet, her eyes sharp, waiting for whatever was about to unfold. Amos had come back. The door opened with a creak, and there he was, Amos. He stood in the doorway, dust and grime still clinging to his coat, his crooked smile in place, but his eyes were wary. He didn't come inside immediately, as if trying to gauge the cabin's mood, but Elias could feel the tension thick in the air. This time there was no pretense, no charm in Amos's demeanor. "Lila," Amos said, his voice a little softer, though there was still that underlying arrogance. "Elias, we need to talk." Lila didn't move, her stance resolute, her expression hardening at seeing him. "Talk?" she repeated, her voice cold. "You've said enough already, Amos." Elias stepped forward, his jaw set, his eyes locked on the man who had caused so much trouble. "You've got one chance to leave," Elias said, his voice low but firm. "Or we expose everything you've done, all the lies, the land deal, the death of my sister." Amos shifted uncomfortably under their combined gaze but didn't back down. He tried to put on the same confident smile, but it faltered. "You think you're going to win this? You think I'm just going to walk away?" "I think you've already lost," Lila said, her voice steady but filled with authority. "And if you don't leave now, we'll ensure everyone knows the truth. You won't have a place to hide." Amos's eyes flickered, and for the first time he seemed uncertain. His hands twitched at his sides, and he glanced toward the door as if considering his options. But there was nothing left for him here. No escape, no way to save face. His past had caught up with him, and for the first time in years it was clear he had nowhere to run. The silence stretched, thick with the moment's weight, until Amos finally exhaled sharply, as if resigning himself to the inevitable. "Fine, I'll leave," he muttered, "but don't think this is over." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the cabin, his boots crunching against the snow as he mounted his horse and disappeared into the distance. Lila watched him go, her shoulders squared, the strength of her defiance clear. It was over. Elias stayed still for a moment, letting the silence of the cabin settle around them. Then slowly he turned to Lila. "It's done," he said, as much for himself as for her. "We're free of him." Lila nodded, the tension leaving her body. She didn't speak for a moment, as if the weight of everything was still sinking in. But then, her gaze softened as she looked at Elias. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for standing by me." Elias gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable, but his eyes filled with something that wasn't just duty. "You didn't need me to fight for you," he said, his voice low. "You fought for yourself." A soft smile tugged at Lila's lips, her eyes meeting his. It was the first time she had truly smiled since he had found her in the snow, and it spoke of hope, resilience, and the future they could now build together. They stood together, the cabin, around them now a place of warmth and safety, symbolizing the life they had carved from the harsh land. Later that afternoon, as the sun climbed higher in the sky and the snow began to melt in patches, Lila found something unexpected. She had been sorting through the remains of Amos's satchel, trying to make sense of the tangled mess of papers, when something caught her eye. A deed. She unfolded the old, brittle paper, her hands trembling as she read the words. It was a deed to the land. The land that they had fought for. The land that Amos had claimed was his. But this deed, it wasn't his. It was hers. Lila stared at the document, the truth sinking like a weight lifted from her chest. The land wasn't just promised to her, it was already hers, inherited from a relative she hadn't known about until now. She looked at Elias, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. I didn't know," she said, her voice quiet but filled with wonder. "I didn't know it was mine all along. Elias stepped closer, his eyes scanning the deed. Then we don't have to fight anymore. It's yours, Lila. The world outside was awakening. The barren winter ground slowly turned green as the first signs of spring began to show. The aspens were budding, their branches swaying in the light breeze, and the rivers were flowing again, clear and fresh from the melting snow. It was a new season, a new beginning. Elias and Lila stood together, looking out the window at the life waiting for them. They had both been through so much, but now they had something to build, a home, a future, a place where they could grow. They had found their way through the storm, and now as the seasons changed, they would begin anew. They returned to the cabin, the warmth now matched by the promise of what would come. Together they would create something more than survival. They would make a life, a community. Lila looked up at Elias, her eyes full of resolve. We can build something here, together. And with that, they knew. Whatever the future held, they would face it side by side. The months had passed, and the once desolate homestead Elias and Lila had claimed as their own was now a place of life, warmth, and purpose. The harsh winter had given way to a vibrant spring, the landscape transforming before their eyes. Once, small and straightforward, the cabin stood firm against the elements, symbolizing what they had built together. Around them, the land stretched broad, green, and fertile, and Lila's small garden flourished with the promise of a future. Inside, the warmth of the fire flickered as the scent of fresh bread and stew filled the air. Lila was at the stove, her laughter ringing through the cabin like music. Elias stood by the window, lingering on the people gathered around the fire pit outside. Neighbors had come to visit, bringing food and stories to share. It was a community they had never imagined but had come to cherish, where they were no longer alone, no longer survivors in solitude. They were part of something more, something real. Lila's laughter was different now. It was light, unburdened by the ghosts of her past. A sound that had once seemed so distant but now came easily, like the wind through the trees. She had come far from the woman who had arrived in that tattered wedding dress, lost and broken in the snow. Now she was a survivor, a woman who had claimed her destiny, standing tall beside the man who had offered her nothing but truth and the chance for a fresh start. They had built this life together, and it was theirs. Elias looked over at her. His face softened in a way that had never been there before. The lines of grief that had once etched deep into his skin were still present, but they had been joined by the gentleness of love, the quiet strength of someone who had found peace. He wasn't the man who had wandered the mountains, burdened by the weight of loss. He was new, someone who had found a connection and learned to open his heart again. When Lila caught his eye, she smiled, the warmth of it filling the room like the light from the fire. They didn't need words to understand the bond that had grown between them. It was deeper than anything either of them had ever imagined. The quiet support in the challenging moments, the laughter in the easy ones, and the shared strength had allowed them both to heal. That evening, as the stars twinkled in the clear Montana sky, Elias and Lila stood together, hands clasped, exchanging vows of mutual support. It was a quiet ceremony with no crowd or fanfare, just the two of them promising to face whatever came next as a team. There was no need for anything more. Their bond was solid, their commitment clear. They had already built a life as strong as the land they had fought for. Lila's voice trembled slightly as she spoke the vows, the words filled with the weight of everything she had endured. I promise to stand by you, to fight with you, to build a future that honors our past and never to let go of what we've created. Elias's words were simple, but their sincerity was undeniable. I promise to protect you, to be your partner, and to walk with you, no matter what lies ahead. The stars above them seemed to shine brighter at that moment, as if the very heavens had witnessed their promises. They kissed softly, and the world around them was quiet, as if holding its breath for a moment longer. Their homestead had become a thriving, vibrant place, reflecting their shared journey. Neighbors came by regularly, and their visits were no longer rare but a regular part of life. They helped each other with the work, shared meals, and celebrated the joys of the land and the bonds they had forged. What was once an isolated existence was now a rich, thriving community of trust, friendship, and support. A quiet sense of pride filled their hearts as Elias and Lila stood together by the window, watching the last of the daylight fade behind the mountains. They had done it. They had survived. They had thrived. And now, they were no longer just two people building a life from the ashes of betrayal. They were partners, friends, and the beginning of something that would outlast them both. A community, a legacy, a home. Lila rested her head on Elias's shoulder, feeling his warmth, the steady rhythm of his heart, and the peaceful certainty that had settled into their lives. They had come so far from where they started, from the dying bride in the snow to this moment of hope, love, and renewal. Share this unforgettable story of courage and redemption with someone who needs hope. Elias's voice was a murmur, but the words held weight. Lila turned to him, her eyes sparkling with a calm joy that could only come from someone who had learned to believe in second chances. She smiled softly, knowing that their story wasn't just theirs. It was something others could learn from, something others could hold on to. With a final glance out the window at the peaceful night sky, they turned back to each other, ready for whatever the future held, together. And with that, the story of Elias and Lila came to a close, a tale of survival, redemption, and the power of love. Could you share it? Like it. Subscribe to the channel for more stories.